If silence had a sound, it would be the moment a German shepherd refuses to walk away from a wrecked ambulance under a burning Nevada sky. The desert highway outside Fallon stretched wide and empty that afternoon, heat rising in slow waves from the asphalt like invisible breath, when emergency responders arrived at a scene that felt wrong in a way no one could immediately explain. A medical transport ambulance had come to rest off the shoulder of the road, tilted slightly against the sandy embankment, its flashing lights still blinking in a slow, fading rhythm as if the machine itself was running out of strength. Dust drifted through the air, settling over the hood, over broken glass that glittered harmlessly like scattered stars, and over the tense stillness that wrapped the entire scene. That was when they saw him. A German shepherd stood beside the vehicle, unmoving, as if time had decided to pause just for him. His coat was dusted with pale desert sand, his posture rigid but controlled, and his amber eyes stayed locked on the ambulance door like he was listening for something no human could hear. Officer Ethan Blake arrived first, stepping out of his patrol vehicle with slow, deliberate movements, his hand instinctively resting near his radio as he took in the scene. Behind him, paramedic Laura Mitchell moved quickly but carefully, scanning for signs of urgency, her eyes narrowing the moment she saw the dog. "That's not normal behavior," she said quietly, not as a warning, but as an observation shaped by experience. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He had seen stray animals before, had responded to accidents where chaos made sense, but this wasn't chaos. This was restraint. This was intention. The German shepherd did not bark, did not circle, did not flee. Instead, he pressed his nose briefly against the side of the ambulance, then stepped back, as if confirming something inside was still there, still real, still holding on. The silence between them grew heavier, stretching across the heat like a shared understanding no one had yet put into words. Laura stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against gravel, and she tilted her head, listening. "There's something inside," she murmured, her voice tightening slightly. Ethan raised a hand, signaling caution more out of instinct than certainty. Protocol existed for situations like this, but protocol did not account for the way the dog refused to move, as if his entire world had narrowed to the sealed metal frame in front of him. A passing wind rolled through the highway, carrying the faint scent of dust and fuel, and still the shepherd did not break his focus. Instead, he shifted his weight, lowering his body slightly, not in aggression, but in something closer to waiting. Waiting like he understood timing mattered. Waiting like he had done this before. Laura exchanged a glance with Ethan, and in that glance was the quiet realization that whatever was happening here was not random. The ambulance was not just a vehicle. It was a sealed moment in time, holding something fragile enough that even the air around it felt careful. Ethan stepped forward slowly, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the unseen interior. No response came, only the faint hum of distant traffic and the rhythmic blink of emergency lights growing weaker by the minute. The German shepherd let out a single low breath, almost imperceptible, and then placed himself directly in front of the rear doors, blocking access without force, without fear, only presence. It was not defiance. It was guardianship. Laura's expression changed slightly, her professional focus sharpening into concern. "We need to assess what's inside," she said, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would not be simple. Ethan nodded once, but he did not move yet. Something about the stillness felt fragile, like stepping forward too quickly might break whatever invisible thread was holding the moment together. The shepherd turned his head slightly, glancing at Ethan for the first time, and in that brief exchange there was no hostility, only recognition, as if he were saying without sound that what was inside mattered more than anything outside. The desert sun continued its slow descent, stretching shadows across the highway, and in that fading light the ambulance became less like a vehicle and more like a sealed promise waiting to be understood. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. And in that hesitation, everything began. The silence that followed felt heavier than the heat itself, as if the entire stretch of highway had been placed under a glass dome where even sound struggled to survive. Officer Ethan Blake kept his eyes fixed on the sealed rear doors of the ambulance, reading every detail he could, from the slight vibration of the emergency light to the way dust continued to settle unevenly along the edges of the frame. Nothing about it looked ordinary anymore. It was not just a vehicle at rest, it felt like something holding its breath. Beside him, Laura Mitchell adjusted her gloves out of habit rather than necessity, her gaze locked on the German shepherd who still refused to move from his position. The dog's posture had not changed since they arrived, but something subtle had shifted in his attention. His ears twitched once, then angled forward with precision, as if catching a frequency no human ear could detect. Laura lowered her voice. "He is not guarding the vehicle," she said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "He is responding to it." Ethan did not reply immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the rear doors, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He raised his radio and requested status confirmation for the transport unit, but only static returned for a moment before dispatch responded with a delayed acknowledgement that did little to clarify the situation. The ambulance had been listed as a routine transfer earlier that morning, yet nothing about the scene in front of them matched the calm tone of that report. Ethan lowered the radio and looked again at the dog. The German shepherd had now shifted slightly, positioning himself not in front of the doors, but angled toward the seam where metal met frame, as if understanding structure in a way instinct could not fully explain. Laura stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she listened. At first there was nothing, only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional crackle of cooling metal. Then, beneath it, something faint emerged, so subtle it almost blended into imagination. A sound, uneven and fragile, like the smallest thread of life brushing against silence. Laura froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ethan held his breath, focusing entirely on the ambulance. It came again, not louder, but more certain, as if responding to attention itself. The German shepherd reacted instantly, his body lowering slightly, not in aggression but in urgency, his gaze locked on the same point where the sound originated. Ethan's expression changed. Whatever this was, it was no longer a question of protocol or procedure. He signaled for caution, though his own stance had already shifted into decision. Laura moved to the side of the ambulance, placing a hand near the frame, feeling for vibration, for heat, for anything that might confirm what they were hearing. The desert wind passed over them again, but this time it felt less like emptiness and more like anticipation. Ethan spoke quietly into his radio once more, requesting immediate authorization for emergency entry assessment, his voice steady but firm. The delay in response stretched longer than before, and in that gap, the German shepherd took one slow step forward until he was directly touching the metal door with his nose. He exhaled softly, a controlled, steady breath that fogged faintly against the surface before fading into the dry air. Laura looked at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. "He knows something is still inside," she said. Ethan nodded slightly, though his eyes never left the door. The faint sound came again, and this time there was no doubt it carried pattern, a rhythm that suggested awareness rather than randomness. Something alive was inside, maintaining presence in the smallest possible way. Ethan placed his hand on the door handle, but did not pull yet. He paused, not from hesitation, but from recognition that whatever lay beyond that threshold required precision rather than urgency. The German shepherd pressed closer, his shoulder now touching the metal, anchoring himself as if sharing responsibility for what was contained within. Laura stepped back half a step, giving space, her breathing slow but focused. The radio finally crackled with authorization, but Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the dog, and in that brief exchange there was a silent agreement formed not through command, but through certainty. The desert seemed to hold its breath again, the wind slowing, as if waiting for the outcome of a decision that mattered beyond the moment itself. Ethan tightened his grip on the handle, and the world narrowed to the sound of distant heat, faint life, and the unwavering presence of a guardian who had refused to walk away. The moment Ethan Blake tightened his grip on the rear handle of the ambulance, the entire environment seemed to narrow into a single point of focus, as if the desert itself had leaned in to witness what would happen next. The heat shimmered across the asphalt in slow, wavering lines, and even the distant highway noise faded into something almost unreal. Beside him, Laura Mitchell held her position with controlled tension, her eyes moving between Ethan's hand and the German Shepherd, who now stood so close to the vehicle that his chest gently touched the metal frame. The dog did not move away. Instead, he remained anchored there, as if the surface itself was part of him now, as if stepping back would mean abandoning something far more important than instinct could explain. Ethan exhaled slowly, then pulled the handle. The door released with a soft mechanical click that felt unusually loud in the stillness. For a brief moment, nothing else happened. The interior of the ambulance remained partially shadowed, the contrast between the bright desert light and the dim compartment creating a visual threshold that no one crossed immediately. Laura leaned slightly forward, her breath steady but deliberate, and Ethan adjusted his stance, preparing for whatever reality might present itself. The German Shepherd reacted first. His ears lifted, his posture tightening not in alarm, but in recognition. There was no hesitation in him now, only certainty. He stepped forward as the door swung wider, revealing the interior space bit by bit, until the truth of what had been hidden began to emerge into the sunlight. Inside, the compartment was not empty. A paramedic lay, secured on the rear bench, conscious but visibly weakened, his uniform marked with dust and signs of prolonged strain. His name badge read Daniel Harper. His breathing was steady but shallow, and his eyes shifted toward the opening with slow awareness. Beside him, carefully secured in a secondary safety harness, was an infant carrier, small and stabilized, holding a newborn who remained still but present, wrapped in thermal layers designed for transport. The scene carried a quiet weight that immediately replaced tension with something deeper, something that resembled relief mixed with disbelief. Laura moved instantly into professional focus, stepping closer to assess both individuals without hesitation. Ethan remained at the threshold for a second longer, processing what he was seeing, the realization settling in that this was not a collapsed transport in the traditional sense, but a critical situation that had been contained through sheer persistence and timing. The German Shepherd stepped forward without waiting for instruction, moving directly to the edge of the open door. He did not enter aggressively or disruptively. Instead, he positioned himself so that his presence remained steady and visible to those inside, his eyes shifting between the paramedic and the infant carrier with unwavering attention. Daniel Harper's gaze shifted toward the dog, and something in his expression softened slightly, as if recognition had occurred even through exhaustion. Laura immediately began checking vital signs, her movements precise and controlled, while speaking calmly to maintain awareness within the confined space. Ethan scanned the surroundings once more, confirming there were no additional hazards, but his attention kept returning to the same central point, the quiet stability of the German Shepherd who had refused to leave. The dog remained completely focused on the infant carrier, his posture lowered slightly now, not in submission, but in attentiveness, as if maintaining proximity was essential to keeping the situation stable. A faint sound emerged again, this time clearer, confirming what had only been suspected before. The newborn was alive, protected by layers, and timing that no one had yet fully reconstructed. Laura exchanged a brief glance with Ethan, and in that glance there was acknowledgement of something rare in their line of work, a moment where outcome and uncertainty briefly balanced in a fragile state of grace. The desert wind passed through the open doors of the ambulance, carrying heat and dust, but inside that narrow space there was only controlled urgency and quiet awareness. Ethan finally stepped forward, assisting Laura in stabilizing the paramedic, while maintaining awareness of the dog who had become an unmoving point of focus at the threshold. The German Shepherd did not shift his attention even once, remaining fixed on the infant as though every breath mattered equally. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sounds were measured movement, distant wind, and the steady rhythm of survival being carefully preserved. In that stillness, it became clear that the situation was not defined by what had gone wrong, but by what had been held together long enough to still be saved. Inside the ambulance, the air felt different the moment attention shifted fully to what had been hidden. It was no longer about uncertainty or tension, but about careful, controlled urgency, the kind that arrives when fragile life is confirmed and every second begins to matter in a new way. Laura Mitchell worked quickly beside the paramedic Daniel Harper, her voice steady as she asked simple, grounding questions meant to anchor him to the present moment. Daniel responded slowly, his words measured but coherent, his condition stable enough to allow careful movement rather than immediate evacuation. Ethan Blake remained near the open doors, partially inside the threshold, scanning both the interior and the surrounding highway with practiced awareness. The desert outside still burned with heat, but inside the ambulance, everything felt quieter, almost suspended. The German Shepherd had not moved from his position at the edge of the door. He remained focused entirely on the infant carrier, his posture low and steady, as if he understood that even small disturbances mattered here. Laura adjusted the thermal wrap around the newborn with delicate precision, confirming that the child's breathing remained consistent. "Stable for now," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance. Ethan nodded once, then shifted his attention back to Daniel, who was now more aware, his gaze drifting between the responders and the dog standing watch at the threshold. There was something in Daniel's expression that suggested recognition, not of individuals, but of the situation itself, as though he understood how narrowly this moment had been held together. The German Shepherd finally stepped forward another half step, still not entering fully, but close enough that his presence extended into the interior space. His eyes remained fixed on the infant, calm but intensely focused, as if confirming again and again that the child was still present, still breathing, still here. Laura noticed the dog's behavior and slowed her movements slightly, acknowledging without words that his presence was not interference, but alignment. Ethan spoke quietly into his radio, requesting medical transport backup and confirming stable conditions, his tone steady and controlled. The dispatcher's response came through with urgency softened by relief, indicating that additional units were en route within minutes. The highway around them remained largely empty, the isolation of the desert emphasizing how far they were from immediate infrastructure support. Inside that isolation, however, the ambulance had become a contained environment of recovery, where every action carried measurable weight. Daniel Harper shifted slightly on the bench, his voice low as he tried to speak, but Laura gently encouraged him to conserve energy, assuring him that help was already in motion. The German Shepherd responded to Daniel's movement with a brief glance, then returned his focus to the infant, maintaining the same steady vigilance that had defined his presence from the beginning. Ethan observed this pattern carefully. It was not random behavior. It was continuity. The dog was not reacting to chaos. He was maintaining structure. Minutes passed with controlled efficiency. Laura completed a full check of both patients, confirming no immediate critical deterioration. Ethan assisted in securing the interior space for transport readiness, ensuring that everything would remain stable during movement. The desert wind shifted again, brushing against the open doors, carrying heat and dust into the otherwise contained environment, but the sense of urgency had transformed into something more measured. Even the light outside had begun to soften slightly, the harshness of midday giving way to a more angled glow that stretched long across the road. The German Shepherd finally lowered himself into a resting position just outside the threshold, still facing inward, his body relaxed but alert. It was not exhaustion that guided him, but completion of purpose for the moment. Laura glanced at him briefly and then returned to her work, understanding without needing explanation that his role in this moment was not temporary curiosity, but sustained presence. Ethan stood for a moment longer, looking between all 3 points of focus, the paramedic, the newborn, and the dog who had refused to leave any of them behind. There was no need for words now. The situation had already spoken for itself in the only language that mattered, presence held against uncertainty, attention sustained against silence, and a fragile continuation of life maintained through quiet endurance. As the distant sound of approaching emergency support vehicles began to grow faintly audible along the highway, the scene remained steady, held together by discipline, care, and the unspoken understanding that some moments are not defined by what breaks, but by what continues. The distant sound of approaching emergency vehicles grew steadily louder along the empty Nevada highway, rising like a low promise breaking through the heat and silence that had held the scene together for what felt like far longer than minutes. Ethan Blake turned slightly toward the sound, his posture relaxing just enough to acknowledge that help was finally arriving. while still maintaining full awareness of the fragile situation inside and around the ambulance. The German Shepherd remained in place near the threshold, his body still, angled toward the infant carrier, though his attention briefly shifted toward the approaching vehicles, registering their presence without alarm. Laura Mitchell straightened slightly as well, her hands still steady on the interior equipment, her focus never leaving the newborn, whose breathing remained stable under her careful monitoring. Daniel Harper, still seated inside the ambulance, exhaled slowly as he became more aware of the presence of additional support, his expression easing just slightly as the isolation of the situation began to lift. Within moments, 2 additional emergency response units arrived, their vehicles slowing to a controlled stop along the shoulder, dust rising around their tires before settling back into the heat. Paramedics stepped out quickly but without panic, immediately assessing the situation with trained efficiency, their attention drawn first to the open ambulance and then to the unusual presence of the German Shepherd standing guard at the entrance. One of the arriving responders paused briefly at the sight of the dog, noting the stillness and focus in his posture before continuing forward with professional caution. Ethan stepped aside to brief them quickly, his voice calm but precise, summarizing the condition of both patients and the current stability of the scene. Laura continued her work inside, guiding the transition of medical responsibility without disrupting the calm environment that had been established. The German Shepherd did not move as new personnel approached, but he tracked each motion carefully, as if verifying that every action remained aligned with the state of safety he had maintained from the beginning. One of the paramedics gently began preparing the infant carrier for transfer, speaking softly while maintaining steady movements, ensuring that no sudden change disturbed the child's condition. The dog shifted slightly closer, not obstructing, but observing at close range, his presence unwavering and deeply focused. Ethan noticed this and briefly gestured to the team, indicating that the animal was not a risk factor but a stabilizing presence, a silent participant in the entire sequence of events. As the transfer process began, Daniel Harper was carefully assisted out of the ambulance, his movements slow but controlled, supported by 2 responders who maintained constant communication with Laura regarding his condition. The German Shepherd turned his head to follow Daniel's movement for a moment, then returned his focus to the infant carrier as it was gently secured for transport. The entire process unfolded with a quiet precision that contrasted sharply with the isolation and uncertainty that had defined the earlier moments of discovery. As the infant carrier was lifted carefully into the receiving unit, the German Shepherd took one slow step forward, then stopped, watching intently, as if confirming that the child remained safe even outside his immediate reach. Laura noticed this and paused briefly, her expression softening as she acknowledged the animal's unwavering attention. "He has not left their side since we arrived," she said quietly, more as an observation than a report. Ethan nodded, his gaze following the dog for a moment before returning to the coordinated activity around him. There was something consistent in the dog's behavior that did not align with randomness or confusion, but rather with purpose that had carried through every phase of the situation. As the final adjustments were made and both patients were secured for transport to the nearest medical facility, the desert air felt slightly less heavy, as if the completion of immediate crisis had shifted the weight of the moment into something more reflective. The German Shepherd finally stepped back from the ambulance, not leaving, but repositioning himself a short distance away where he could still observe everything without interference. His posture lowered slightly, not in exhaustion, but in a state of sustained alertness that had begun to transition into calm vigilance. Ethan walked slowly toward him for the first time without urgency, stopping a few feet away, studying the animal with quiet attention. The dog met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the departing medical unit carrying the infant and paramedic away from the scene. In that exchange, no commands were spoken and no expectations were given, yet something unspoken settled between them, an understanding that presence alone had been enough to alter the outcome of the moment. Laura joined Ethan shortly after, watching the convoy of medical vehicles begin to pull away along the highway, their lights fading into the shimmering horizon. The desert returned gradually to its natural stillness, the wind resuming its slow movement across the open road, but the atmosphere had changed, softened by what had just been preserved within it. The German shepherd remained standing at the roadside for several seconds longer, facing the direction of the departing vehicles, before finally lowering his head slightly, as if acknowledging that his role in this moment had reached its conclusion. Nothing about the scene was loud or dramatic, yet everything about it carried weight that lingered beyond the visible actions. Ethan finally spoke in a low tone, almost to himself, recognizing not just the outcome, but the quiet persistence that had shaped it. Laura did not respond immediately, simply observing the road ahead where the convoy disappeared, carrying with it the fragile continuation of life that had been held together in silence. Behind them, the highway stretched empty once again, but the presence that had anchored the moment remained, not in motion, but in memory. As the emergency convoy disappeared into the shimmering horizon, the Nevada highway slowly returned to its original silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier after something meaningful has just taken place. Ethan Blake stood near the edge of the road for a moment longer, his eyes following the fading red and blue lights until they dissolved completely into heat distortion and distance. Beside him, Laura Mitchell adjusted her gloves again out of habit, though the urgency had already passed, replaced by the lingering weight of what they had just witnessed and contained. The German shepherd remained a few yards away from them, still facing the direction where the vehicles had gone, his posture no longer rigid but steady, as if holding onto the final echo of presence before releasing it fully. Ethan finally exhaled deeply, his shoulders lowering as the tension that had carried him through the last hour began to settle into something quieter. "That could have gone very differently," Laura said softly, not as a statement of fear, but as acknowledgement of how narrow the margin had been. Ethan nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly toward the dog. "It did not," he replied simply, his voice calm but reflective. The German shepherd turned slowly at that moment, as if responding not to sound but to meaning. His amber eyes met Ethan's for a brief second, steady and clear, before he lowered his head slightly and began to walk a few steps away from the roadside. There was no urgency in his movement now, only resolution. Laura watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful. "He never left them," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan followed the dog with his eyes as he moved across the gravel shoulder, then stopped near a patch of shade cast by the ambulance. He was the only constant thing in that entire situation, Ethan said. The wind moved gently across the highway, carrying with it the warmth of the desert afternoon now beginning to shift toward late day. Dust still lingered in the air, but it felt less chaotic, more settled, as if the environment itself was recovering from what had just unfolded. Laura looked down the empty road once more, where the convoy had vanished minutes earlier. The infant would not have made it through transport delays without stabilization, she said softly. Ethan nodded again, acknowledging the precision behind the outcome. And Daniel Harper would have been alone in there longer than he should have been, he added. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds after that. The weight of what they had prevented did not need elaboration. It existed in the space between words, in the quiet recognition that outcomes like this were not always guaranteed, no matter how trained or prepared the responders were. The German shepherd finally sat down near the edge of the shade, his body relaxed but alert, as if he had transitioned from action into watchful rest without fully disengaging from awareness. Ethan slowly approached him this time without urgency, stopping a few feet away and kneeling slightly to bring himself closer to the dog's level. The animal did not retreat. Instead, he held his position, acknowledging the presence without tension. Laura remained a short distance behind, observing the interaction without interrupting it. Ethan studied the dog for a moment, noting the steadiness in his breathing, the calm in his posture, the absence of confusion or distress. "You stayed with them," Ethan said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition. The German shepherd blinked slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the road again, then back to Ethan. There was no visible reaction beyond presence itself, but something in the stillness conveyed understanding. Laura stepped slightly closer now, her voice low. "Animals do not always respond to situations the way we expect," she said. "Sometimes they respond better than we do." Ethan glanced at her, then back at the dog. The desert light had softened further, stretching long shadows across the ground, turning the asphalt into a surface that reflected warmth instead of heat. In that transition, the entire scene felt less like aftermath and more like continuation. Ethan slowly stood again, taking a final look down the highway where everything had begun. The German shepherd rose as well, not following, not leaving, but simply aligning himself with the moment as it existed now. Laura checked her watch, confirming that backup units would likely return for formal reporting, but neither of them moved immediately. There was no urgency left in the environment, only reflection. The dog took one final step forward, then paused, looking between Ethan and the empty road, as if confirming that his presence was no longer required in the same way it had been before. Ethan gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, not as command, but as acknowledgement. The German shepherd turned slightly toward the open desert, then began to walk slowly away from the roadside, his movement unhurried and calm, blending into the vastness of the Nevada landscape. Laura watched him go until he became part of the distance, then finally spoke in a quiet tone. He knew exactly where he needed to be, she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. He continued looking at the horizon for a moment longer, then exhaled slowly. And he stayed there until it was no longer needed, he said. The highway remained open and empty around them, the wind moving gently across the surface, carrying dust and silence into the fading light of the afternoon. The desert road stretched endlessly in both directions, as if it had returned to pretending nothing had ever happened along its surface. Ethan Blake remained near the shoulder of the highway for a while longer, standing in quiet stillness as the final traces of the convoy disappeared completely from sight. The heat of the afternoon still lingered, but it no longer felt aggressive. It felt distant, softened by the passage of time and the fading urgency of the moment that had just concluded. Laura Mitchell stood beside him, her arms relaxed now, her focus no longer locked on immediate action but on reflection. The German shepherd had moved farther away, walking slowly along the edge of the open terrain until he became a small, steady figure against the vast Nevada landscape. There was no hesitation in his movement, only a natural continuation of purpose now that everything he had held in place had safely moved beyond his reach. Ethan finally broke the silence. "We arrived expecting a collapse," he said quietly, his voice measured. "What we found was something that held together long enough to matter." Laura nodded slightly, her eyes still following the direction the dog had gone. "He held it together," she replied. "More than anything else on that road." The wind moved gently across the highway, carrying dust in slow patterns that drifted and settled without urgency. Ethan looked down at the ground for a moment, as if replaying the sequence of events in his mind, each detail now rearranged not by tension, but by understanding. The German shepherd had not reacted to chaos. He had responded to presence. That realization settled in quietly, not as surprise, but as acknowledgement of something rarely seen in the field. Laura shifted her weight slightly, glancing back toward the empty stretch of road where the ambulance had been earlier. "The infant will be transferred for continued care," she said softly, more to confirm than to inform. Ethan nodded once. "And Daniel Harper will recover under observation," he added. The facts were simple now, stripped of urgency, yet they carried weight because of how close they had come to being otherwise. The dog continued walking at a slow, steady pace across the open desert edge, not leaving abruptly, but fading into distance with intention, as if his role had always been defined by moments rather than permanence. Ethan watched him until the figure became smaller, blending with the natural tones of the terrain. "There are things you cannot train into response protocols," Ethan said after a long pause. Laura turned slightly toward him. "Like what?" she asked. Ethan took a slow breath before answering. "Like knowing when to stay." The statement lingered in the air between them, not as philosophy, but as observation drawn directly from what they had witnessed. The highway remained quiet, no longer filled with flashing lights or emergency motion, only the slow return of stillness that follows after resolution. Laura began walking slowly back toward their vehicle, and Ethan followed, though he glanced one last time toward the direction the German shepherd had gone. The animal was now barely visible, a moving silhouette against the open land, continuing forward without urgency, without distraction, guided only by a calm internal certainty that no one could fully define. As they reached their vehicle, Ethan paused briefly before opening the door. "We almost missed what was happening there," he said quietly. Laura did not respond immediately. She looked once more across the highway, then toward the horizon. "We did not miss it," she said finally. "We just arrived in time to see it finish." Ethan closed the door slowly after getting in, and the sound of it echoed softly in the warm air. Outside, the desert returned fully to its natural rhythm, the wind moving across empty asphalt, carrying with it the memory of a moment that had required no noise to change everything. The Nevada desert had fully settled back into its natural rhythm by the time Ethan Blake and Laura Mitchell reached their vehicle, the silence no longer tense but expansive, stretching across the highway like an open breath after something deeply significant has passed. The heat still shimmered above the asphalt in slow, wavering layers, but even that seemed less oppressive now, as if the land itself had accepted the resolution of what had unfolded earlier. Ethan closed the door behind him and remained seated for a moment, his hands resting loosely on his lap as he looked out through the windshield at the empty road ahead. Laura sat beside him, adjusting her seatbelt but not yet starting the engine, her gaze lingering on the same horizon that had just witnessed everything. Neither of them spoke immediately. The absence of urgency had created a space where words felt unnecessary, almost too small for what had been experienced. After several seconds, Ethan finally broke the silence. "It is strange how quickly everything returns to normal," he said quietly. Laura turned her head slightly toward him. "It does not return," she replied. "It just continues like nothing happened." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the thought without resistance. Outside, the desert wind moved steadily across the highway, carrying fine dust that glowed faintly in the afternoon light. Somewhere far off in the distance, a single bird crossed the sky, its movement small but deliberate against the vast openness. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes still forward. "That dog did not behave like anything I have seen in standard field response situations," he said after a moment. Laura exhaled softly, as if choosing her words carefully. "He was not responding to instructions," she said. "He was responding to presence, to continuity." Ethan glanced toward her briefly, then back at the road. The German shepherd had already disappeared from sight beyond the open terrain, but the impression of his actions remained, not as memory alone, but as something structurally imprinted into the sequence of events. It was not dramatic in the way most people imagined critical moments to be. It was quiet, consistent, and precise in a way that defied easy explanation. Laura reached forward and finally started the vehicle. The engine turned over smoothly, blending into the natural hum of the environment. As they pulled back onto the highway, the tire tracks behind them briefly disturbed the dust before the wind softened them again into invisibility. Ethan looked out to the side as they drove, watching the endless desert pass in slow variation. "Do you think he was trained for something like that?" he asked. Laura considered the question for a moment. "Training explains reaction," she said. "It does not always explain choice." Ethan did not respond immediately. The vehicle continued forward, the road stretching out in clean lines under the fading angle of sunlight. The atmosphere inside the car remained calm, but reflective, as if both of them were processing something that did not require immediate categorization to be understood. Laura glanced once more toward the rearview mirror, where the empty highway reflected only heat and distance. "That moment inside the ambulance," she said softly, "was already stable before we even opened it." Ethan nodded slightly. "Because someone was already holding it together," he replied. The words lingered between them without further explanation. The road continued uninterrupted, passing mile markers and open stretches of sand and rock that seemed unchanged by human presence. Yet beneath that unchanged surface, something subtle had shifted in perspective, not in the environment itself, but in the way it was now understood. As the vehicle moved farther away from the scene, Ethan leaned his head slightly against the seat, his eyes still open but focused on nothing in particular. "There are situations we classify as chance," he said after a long pause. Laura kept her attention on the road. "And there are situations we do not fully classify at all," she replied. The statement settled naturally, without need for agreement or debate. The desert light began to soften as the afternoon moved closer toward evening, casting longer shadows across the highway. In that gradual change, The events of earlier felt less like an isolated incident and more like a moment that had briefly aligned everything into coherence before releasing it again. Ethan finally closed his eyes for a brief moment, not from exhaustion, but from reflection. When he opened them again, the road was still the same, the horizon still wide, and the silence still present. But something within that silence had changed, not louder or clearer, but deeper, as if it now carried the memory of a presence that had once refused to leave until everything that needed to be held was safely carried forward. The vehicle continued along the Nevada highway as the sun lowered closer to the horizon, stretching the sky into long gradients of gold and soft amber that slowly replaced the harsh white intensity of midday. Ethan Blake and Laura Mitchell remained quiet for most of the drive, their conversation having naturally dissolved into reflection rather than necessity. Outside, the desert landscape unfolded in slow, unbroken continuity, empty stretches of sand and rock passing like quiet pages turning without sound. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was steady, no longer shaped by urgency, but by the lingering awareness of what had been witnessed earlier in the day. Ethan finally broke the silence again, his voice low and measured. "There are moments in this job that stay with you," he said. Laura kept her eyes on the road, listening without interruption. "Not because they are dramatic," he continued, "but because they make you realize how much happens before you ever arrive." Laura nodded slightly. "And how much depends on what you notice when you do arrive?" she replied. Ethan glanced out at the horizon, where the last strong light of the day was beginning to fade into softer tones. "That German shepherd," he said after a pause, was not reacting to confusion. He was reacting to certainty. Laura considered that quietly before responding. "Sometimes certainty does not come from understanding," she said. "It comes from recognition." The vehicle passed a long, empty stretch of highway with no visible traffic in either direction, the sense of isolation returning, but no longer feeling unfamiliar. Instead, it felt like a natural continuation of everything that had unfolded. Ethan adjusted his position slightly in the seat, his hands resting loosely as he watched the road. "We trained for emergencies," he said, "but we do not always train for what holds things together before the emergency begins." Laura glanced briefly at him. "That is because some things are not part of the protocol," she said. "They are part of instinct." The conversation faded again into silence, but it was no longer an empty silence. It carried structure, as if both of them were still processing the sequence of events not as a single incident, but as a chain of quiet decisions that had aligned at exactly the right moments. Outside, the desert light continued to shift, the sky deepening in color as evening approached. The highway remained straight and open, guiding them forward without interruption. Ethan leaned slightly toward the window, watching as distant silhouettes of rock formations passed slowly by, their shapes softened by the fading light. "Do you think we will see something like that again?" he asked quietly. Laura did not answer immediately. After a few seconds, she spoke with calm certainty. "We will see many things," she said, "but not everything will stay in place long enough to be seen the way that one was." Ethan nodded once, accepting the thought without resistance. The vehicle continued forward, the sound of tires on asphalt steady and rhythmic, blending with the low hum of the engine. In the rearview mirror, the road behind them stretched empty and unchanged, yet the memory of what had occurred there remained vivid in its simplicity. Not as chaos, but as alignment. Not as disruption, but as presence sustained just long enough to matter. Laura finally turned slightly toward Ethan as the first hints of dusk settled over the horizon. "It is strange," she said softly, "how something so quiet can feel so complete." Ethan kept his eyes forward. "It was not quiet because nothing was happening," he replied. "It was quiet because everything that needed to happen already was." The words settled into the space between them as the vehicle continued deeper into the evening light. The desert outside grew darker in slow increments, the sky shifting from gold to deep blue, and the highway remained open, carrying them away from the moment, but not from its meaning. Nothing else needed to be said. The road simply continued, and so did they.